In 1977, The Clash signed what looked like the deal of a lifetime, a $200,000 contract with CBS Records. By 1979, they were $100,000 in debt to the very corporation they criticized in their songs. The contract that made them famous wasn't for 5 albums, as they thought. It was for 13. And every penny for tours, recordings, and promotion came from their own pockets. What transformed punk's greatest rebels into prisoners of the system they fought against? The answer lies in the fine print of a contract that would become their financial death warrant. Most young bands never read the fine print. The Clash was no exception, recalls Norman Timms, a former CBS executive who witnessed countless artists make the same mistake. They saw the $200,000 figure and stopped reading. The contract's hidden traps were devastating. Instead of 5 albums, they were actually committing to 13. At their recording pace, this meant being tied to CBS for over a decade. Their royalty rate was just 8%, well below the 12 to 15% established acts commanded during this period. For every pound their albums earned, The Clash received pennies, while CBS pocketed the rest. Most crushing of all, they had to cover their own expenses. Studio time, equipment, tour costs, even promotional materials, all came out of advances from CBS that were really just loans adding to their debt. It was like taking out a mortgage from a bank that controlled your entire career. Strummer later told NME in 1981, and the interest rate was murder. The consequences became clear during their 1978 tour. When their equipment van broke down outside Manchester, they were forced to rent replacement gear overnight at emergency rates, instantly adding thousands to their debt. Each night they played to packed venues while falling deeper into the red. Their commitment to fans made matters worse. While other bands raised ticket prices as they grew more popular, The Clash refused. Charging our fans $30 a ticket would be robbery, Strummer insisted in a 1979 Melody Maker interview, visibly angry at the suggestion. "We're not in this to get rich." This principled stance won them loyalty, but devastated their finances. Their concerts consistently lost money despite filling venues with enthusiastic fans. By 1979, despite their first album going gold in the UK and releasing the acclaimed Give 'Em Enough Rope, the band found themselves $100,000 in debt to CBS. Success had paradoxically worsened their financial situation. Mark Williams, a music industry lawyer who later reviewed their contract, puts it bluntly: the more successful they became, the more they toured. The more they toured, the more they spent. The more they spent, the deeper in debt they fell, and CBS collected at every turn. The bitter irony wasn't lost on the band. Their own songs like Complete Control protested the very system that held them captive. As they performed lyrics raging against corporate exploitation, their own contract embodied everything they claimed to stand against. While CBS held The Clash in financial handcuffs, their manager Bernie Rhodes was pulling invisible strings behind the scenes. Rhodes was no ordinary manager. In 1976, in his cramped office near Camden Market, he intentionally brought together Joe Strummer, Mick Jones, and Paul Simonon to create his vision of the perfect punk band. From day one, Rhodes pushed them toward political messaging, driving them to become voices for working-class anger rather than just another rock band. Bernie would clip newspaper articles about unemployment and police brutality and throw them at us during rehearsals, bassist Paul Simonon recalled in a 1999 interview. He'd say, "Write about this, not about girls or cars." Rhodes didn't just find musicians, he engineered a movement, but his influence came with steep costs. By 1979, despite the Clash's rising profile, tensions had reached breaking point. The band fired Rhodes over disagreements about his controlling management style. This should have been the end of his influence, but in 1981, as financial pressures mounted, Strummer made a fateful decision. He demanded Rhodes' return. Joe called me in a panic about money and the label," Rhodes later claimed. He said without me, they'd sink. This decision drove a wedge between Strummer and Jones, who strongly opposed bringing Rhodes back. The atmosphere at their next meeting at Rehearsal Studio in Camden was frigid. Jones sat in the corner, refusing to look at Rhodes while Strummer tried to mediate. Rhodes's manipulation techniques proved remarkably effective. He would speak to band members individually in hushed conversations after rehearsals, planting seeds of doubt about others' commitment or talent. "Bernie would pull me aside and say Mick was trying to turn us into a disco band," drummer Topper Hedden revealed years later. Then he'd tell Mick that Joe wanted to fire him. He'd make up stories about all of us to each other. As the Clash reached their commercial peak with Combat Rock, Rhodes intensified his campaign against Jones. He highlighted Jones's tardiness and creative differences as betrayals rather than typical band disagreements, positioning himself as the solution to problems he was actively creating. During a particularly tense studio session in New York in 1982, Rhodes arrived with news that Jones had been bad-mouthing Strummer to CBS executives. It wasn't true, but in the pressure cooker environment of the band, it seemed plausible enough. Such incidents deepened the growing rift between the two songwriters. Rhodes' financial guidance proved equally harmful. While most managers fight to improve their artists' contracts, Rhodes seemed content to maintain the financial pressure that kept the band dependent on his counsel. There were multiple opportunities to renegotiate with CBS after "London Calling" was a hit, revealed a former label executive who requested anonymity. Rhodes never pushed for better terms when he had leverage. The tension reached breaking point as the Clash achieved their greatest commercial success. In September 1983, in a small meeting room with Rhodes nodding his approval from the corner, Strummer and Simonon fired Jones from the band he helped create. In 1982, the Clash faced a perfect storm. Their fifth album, Combat Rock, was finally bringing them the mainstream recognition they'd fought for. But that same success was tearing them apart. The problem started in the studio, where tensions simmered between Strummer and Jones over the album's direction. Jones wanted to create something bold and experimental, a sprawling double album blending punk with dance and hip-hop. He had already produced his own version titled Rat Patrol from Fort Bragg, complete with extended cuts and dub-influenced production. Strummer, increasingly anxious about their financial obligations to CBS, pushed back hard. "We need something focused that will sell," he insisted during a heated argument at Electric Lady Studios in New York. "Not another experimental mess that puts us deeper in debt." The disagreement wasn't just creative, it was financial and ideological. Jones envisioned artistic growth while Strummer worried about their mounting debts. The final album emerged as a compromise, but the damage to their relationship was done. Despite these tensions, Combat Rock exploded commercially. It reached number 2 in the UK and climbed to number 7 in America. Singles Rock the Casbah and Should I Stay or Should I Go broke through on radio stations that had previously ignored them. By the end of 1982, the album had sold over 2 million copies worldwide, becoming their best-selling record by far. This success transformed their live shows overnight. The band who once played sweaty clubs in London now found themselves in stadiums. In October 1982, they opened for The Who at New York's Shea Stadium, stepping onto a stage surrounded by 50,000 fans. By May 1983, they were co-headlining California's U.S. Festival before a crowd of 140,000 people. The money was finally coming in, but the pressure was crushing them. CBS executives started appearing backstage, talking about follow-up singles and marketing strategies. The same record company they'd criticized for years was now dictating their schedule and priorities. "Success is a strange drug," Strummer told Rolling Stone in early 1983. "Suddenly everyone's your friend, and everyone wants something. You can't remember who you were before it all happened. For a band whose identity was built on rebellion, becoming mainstream stars created an existential crisis. Fans who'd followed them from the beginning questioned their authenticity. Music journalists scrutinized every move for signs they had sold out. The changing dynamic was visible on stage. At a Detroit show in 1983, Jones appeared an hour late, visibly intoxicated. As they launched into "This Is Radio" clash, Strummer glared at him from across the stage, their once tight harmonies now discordant and strained. Camera footage from these later shows captures the physical distance between them, no longer the unified front that once defined their performances, but isolated figures barely acknowledging each other's presence. Behind the scenes, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jones embraced aspects of the rock star lifestyle, showing up late to rehearsals and indulging in the perks of fame. His behavior clashed with Strummer's rigid sense of discipline and working-class values. During their 1983 U.S. tour, they traveled separately, Jones in private cars, Strummer by tour bus. They stayed in different hotels and barely spoke off stage. What had once been a unified group now felt like four separate individuals sharing a stage, but little else. The money they were finally making only intensified their conflicts. After years of financial struggle, success created new tensions about spending, priorities, and control. Arguments about creative decisions quickly escalated into personal attacks. By mid-1983, the Clash had achieved everything they'd supposedly wanted: chart success, stadium shows, and international recognition. Yet they were more miserable than ever. The irony was painful. They had spent years fighting against the music establishment, only to become part of it themselves. The album that brought them mainstream acceptance would be the last with their classic lineup. The commercial triumph of combat rock didn't unite them in celebration. It accelerated their collapse. On September 21, 1983, at Mick Jones's apartment in London's Notting Hill, the guitarist opened his door to find Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon standing stone-faced in the hallway. Behind them, almost hidden in the shadows, stood Bernie Rhodes. "This isn't working anymore," Strummer said flatly, avoiding eye contact. "We're done with you." Just like that, Jones, co-founder, co-writer of their biggest hits and architect of their sound, was out. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. No discussion, no chance to respond. The songwriter behind "Should I Stay or Should I Go" had been told, in no uncertain terms, to go. It was a mistake, Strummer later admitted to NME in 1988, the regret evident. "We shouldn't have fired Mick." But in 1983, with pressure mounting from CBS for new material and Rhodes whispering constant criticism in his ear, Strummer believed it was their only option. Fans were shocked, but few understood the financial pressures pushing the band towards self-destruction. Strummer and Simonon quickly recruited replacements: guitarists Vince White and Nick Shepard, plus drummer Pete Howard, replacing Topper Headon, who had been fired earlier due to drug problems. On paper, the Clash still existed. In reality, its heart had been removed. The new lineup faced impossible odds. Their CBS contract demanded more albums, but they'd just fired their musical compass. The band was expected to continue generating hits while missing the songwriter behind most of their successful songs. Rhodes seized this power vacuum, taking control of their final album, Cut the Crap. Studio sessions in Munich collapsed into chaos as Rhodes, now producing under the fake name Jose Unidos, insisted on adding synthesizers and drum machines against Strummer's wishes. Joe would record guitar parts only to come back the next day and find Rhodes had erased them and replaced them with keyboards, recalled studio engineer Richard Manwaring. He just put his head in his hands. When released in November 1985, Cut the Crap landed with a thud. Critics panned it. Fans ignored it. The album limped to number 16 in UK charts and number 88 in America. The band that recently topped charts with combat rock was now making music nobody wanted. Behind this creative disaster lurked financial ruin. Despite selling millions of records, The Clash was still in debt to CBS. Years of keeping ticket prices affordable had limited touring profits. Their poor royalty rates ensured even multi-platinum albums generated minimal returns. The expensive production of Cut the Crap drained what little remained. As 1986 began, Strummer finally saw the complete picture. Without Jones, with album sales cratering and debt mounting, they were trapped. Their CBS contract had transformed from opportunity to prison sentence. They were creating music they hated to pay debts they couldn't escape. "We were making records because we were contracted to make them," Strummer explained in his last interview about the band's demise. "That isn't creation, that's slavery." By mid-1986, it was over. The band, once called the only band that matters, ended not with revolutionary fervor, but with financial defeat. The anti-establishment heroes had been beaten by the very system they'd spent years raging against. Strummer called Rhodes to his Notting Hill flat and fired him, finally acknowledging what Jones had seen years earlier. 2 weeks later, he officially disbanded The Clash with a simple phone call to CBS Records, finally ending their contractual prison sentence. The Clash's legacy lives on through their music, but they never reunited despite numerous lucrative offers. In 1995, Lollapalooza offered them $5 million for a reunion tour. They flatly refused. "I don't want a fucking $1 million," bassist Paul Simonon told Mick Jones when approached about another reunion offer in the 1990s. Some principles, it seemed, couldn't be bought. Joe Strummer, reflecting on their demise in a 1999 interview, didn't blame Jones or Rhodes. Instead, he pointed to the contract that started it all. "We signed the kind of contract that no group should ever sign. That was our first mistake, and everything after was just consequences." In a cruelly ironic twist, the band that sang most powerfully against the corporate music machine had been destroyed by it. Their 13-album CBS contract from 1977 had set them on a collision course with disaster from the beginning. The story of The Clash isn't just about music. It's about what happens when principles collide with commerce, when rebellion meets reality. Their cautionary tale has influenced generations of musicians who now demand better deals or create independent paths forward. Today, when young bands sign record deals, lawyers often warn them about doing a clash, shorthand for signing away your future for immediate gain. Their self-destruction changed how artists approach the business side of music, perhaps their most enduring legacy. The Clash may have lost their own $1 million war, but the battles they fought helped others win theirs.